She was 19 and homeless. No home, no savings, just $10 to her name. And somehow, she spent it on a rusted old structure in the mountains. People laughed. They said she'd be back in town before winter. But what they didn't know was that the place she bought for $10 was hiding something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. On the morning she turned 19, Ava Carter walked out of the county youth housing center with everything she owned stuffed into a faded canvas backpack. It wasn't much. A few shirts, a worn paperback novel her mother once read to her, and $43 folded carefully inside her wallet. The sky above the small Colorado mountain town was the dull gray of early spring, the kind of sky that made the world feel quiet and unfinished. Patches of old snow clung stubbornly to the edges of the parking lot, slowly melting into muddy water. Behind Ava, the heavy metal door of the building clicked shut. It wasn't a loud sound, but it felt final. For 4 years, that building had been her whole world: rules, schedules, shared rooms, and the quiet understanding that none of the kids inside really had anywhere else to go. Now she was legally an adult, which, in practical terms, meant something much simpler. She was on her own. Just before she left, a tired social worker had handed her a thin manila envelope. Something from the probate office, the woman had said. It belonged to your grandfather. Ava hadn't seen him since she was 9, standing at the edge of the gravel driveway. She opened the envelope slowly, expecting paperwork, maybe a forgotten photograph. Instead, she found a short legal letter and a hand-drawn map leading to a small piece of land in the mountains. At the bottom of the page was a single line that made her pause. To claim the property, the letter said, she would only need to pay $10 in unpaid taxes. $10 for someone who had nowhere to go. That strange little sentence suddenly felt like the beginning of something. For a long time, Ava Carter just stood there at the end of the gravel driveway, holding the letter in her hands while the cold wind slipped through the sleeves of her thin jacket. $10. She read the line again, just to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding it. $10 in unpaid taxes to claim the land. It sounded ridiculous. Land didn't cost $10. A cup of coffee at the gas station down the road cost almost that much. Which meant one of two things was true. Either the letter was some kind of mistake, or the property was so worthless no one else wanted it. Ava folded the paper slowly and slid it back into the envelope. Across the road, the mountains stretched out in long blue-gray ridges, fading into the distance like waves. Somewhere out there, according to the map, was the place her grandfather had left her. She hadn't thought about him in years, not because she didn't want to, but because life had a way of pushing old memories into quiet corners. Still, she remembered small things: the smell of sawdust on his clothes, the way he always carried a pocket knife, the slow, patient way he explained things. He had been a builder, a man who worked with his hands, and he had never been the type to play jokes. That thought stayed with her. $10. It wasn't much of a risk. Even with only $43 left in the world, 10 still felt small compared to the alternative. Because the alternative was simple. Spend the little money she had on a cheap motel for a few nights, and after that, probably end up in a shelter somewhere in the city. Ava looked down the empty road. For the first time in years, there was no one telling her where to go next. No schedule, no curfew, no caseworker. Just a choice. And sometimes, when you have nothing left, even a strange, uncertain choice feels like hope. The next morning, she used $10 of her money to buy a bus ticket heading deeper into the mountains. The ride took almost 4 hours. The bus rattled along narrow highways that wound through pine forests and small forgotten towns where old gas stations leaned slightly toward the road and faded signs hung in dusty storefront windows. Ava sat by the window the whole time, the envelope resting in her lap. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world seemed to become. The city disappeared first, then the suburbs, then even the small towns grew farther apart. Soon it was just trees, mountains, and long empty stretches of road. She didn't talk to anyone on the bus. No one talked to her either. And strangely, that felt okay. For the first time since leaving the housing center, she didn't feel like someone was watching her, judging her, deciding what her future should look like. She was just another passenger heading somewhere unknown, and that anonymity felt like a kind of freedom. The town from the letter turned out to be smaller than she expected. A single main street, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1970s, and a small brick office building where the county legal offices were located. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of paper and old wood. A brass plaque beside one door read, "Harrison and Doyle, attorneys at law." Ava knocked lightly. "Come in," a voice called. Inside the office sat an older man with silver hair and round glasses perched low on his nose. Papers were stacked neatly across his desk, and behind him a tall bookshelf sagged under the weight of old legal books. He looked up as she entered. "You must be Miss Carter," he said gently. Ava nodded, suddenly aware of how young she must look standing there with her backpack. "I received the letter," she said. The lawyer studied her for a moment before gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "I wasn't sure you would come," he admitted. "Why not? Most people don't bother with properties like that." He opened a folder and pulled out a thick set of documents. "Your grandfather purchased the land nearly 30 years ago," he explained. "It has no utilities, no road access, and no registered structures on record." He slid the paperwork across the desk. "If you choose to claim it, the transfer fee and back taxes come to exactly $10. Ava reached into her pocket and placed a slightly wrinkled $10 bill on the desk. The lawyer looked at the bill, then back at her. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "It's all I've got," she said. Something in the man's expression softened. He nodded slowly and pushed the papers toward her. "Then I suppose we should make it official." Ava signed her name where he pointed. The pen trembled slightly in her hand. When she finished, the lawyer closed the folder and slid something heavy across the desk toward her. It was an old iron key, dark with age, cold in her palm. "This," he said, "was left for you as well." Ava turned the key over in her fingers. Outside the window, the mountains stood silent and endless. Somewhere out there was the place that now belonged to her, and whether it was worthless land or the beginning of a completely different life, she was about to find out. The directions the lawyer gave her were simple on paper. Follow the county road for 3 miles. Turn onto a dirt track called Old Timber Road, then walk the rest of the way. In reality, it took Ava nearly 2 hours to find the place. The dirt road looked less like a road and more like 2 faint tire tracks cutting through tall grass and scattered pine trees. The farther she walked, the quieter everything became. No traffic, no houses, no voices, just the wind moving through the branches above her. Her backpack felt heavier with every step, and more than once she wondered if this had been a mistake. $10 might not seem like much, but when it was almost a quarter of everything you owned, it mattered. Eventually, the dirt road faded completely into the forest. According to the map, the property was still another half-mile ahead. Ava pushed through a cluster of thorn bushes and stepped into a small clearing. And there it was, For a moment, she just stood there, staring. The structure in front of her looked even worse than she imagined. A long, curved building made of corrugated metal sat crookedly in the middle of the clearing, like some giant rusted shell abandoned by time. The metal walls were stained orange and brown, where years of rain had eaten through the surface. Weeds grew all the way up to the sides. A few broken windows stared back at her like empty eyes. This was the property she had just bought. Ava let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well," she murmured to herself, "guess this is home." She walked slowly around the building. The place looked like it had been forgotten for decades. The ground was soft and uneven beneath her boots, and small saplings had begun growing near the edges of the structure as if the forest itself was trying to reclaim it. At the front, 2 large metal doors were chained together with a thick, rusted lock. Ava reached into her pocket. The old iron key the lawyer had given her felt surprisingly heavy in her hand. For a moment she hesitated. A strange thought crossed her mind. What if the doors didn't open? What if the key didn't work? What if this entire trip had been nothing more than chasing a ghost? She pushed the thought away and slid the key into the lock. At first, nothing happened. The metal resisted. The key refused to turn. Ava frowned and tried again, twisting harder this time. For a second, it felt like it might snap. Then suddenly, clunk! The lock gave way with a loud metallic snap that echoed across the clearing. The chain slipped loose and fell against the doors with a hollow clang. Ava's heart began beating faster. She grabbed one of the handles and pulled. The door groaned as it opened, the hinges shrieking in protest after years of disuse. Cold, stale air spilled out from the darkness inside. For a moment, Ava couldn't see anything. The interior was enormous and completely shadowed. A single beam of late afternoon sunlight slipped through a narrow crack in the roof, cutting through the dust-filled air like a spotlight. She stepped cautiously inside. Her footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. The place was much bigger than she expected, an empty, curved cavern of metal walls and silence. There was no furniture, no tools, no sign anyone had been there for years. Ava's shoulders sank slightly. Maybe the lawyer had been right. Maybe the land really was worthless. She took a few steps farther into the building, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. That's when she noticed it. Something sitting directly in the middle of the floor, right inside that single beam of sunlight. A wooden crate, small, old, and completely out of place in the empty building. Ava frowned and walked toward it slowly. Her footsteps echoed softly across the concrete. The crate looked ancient, and the wood darkened by age and dust. Thick rope handles hung from the sides, and the lid had long since disappeared. She crouched beside it and brushed away a thin layer of dirt. Inside were rows of glass jars, the kind people used for canning vegetables. At first, she thought they were empty. Then she lifted one. It was heavier than she expected. Much heavier. Ava held it up toward the light. Inside the jar were tightly rolled bundles of paper, stacked one on top of another. Her brow furrowed. Carefully, she unscrewed the lid. The smell of old paper drifted out. She slid one bundle free and unrolled it slowly. Green paper spilled into her hands. $20 bills. Dozens of them. Ava froze. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. She grabbed another jar, and another. Every single one was filled with tightly packed bundles of cash. Her hands began to shake. She sat down heavily on the cold concrete floor, staring at the crate as the reality slowly settled over her. There were at least a dozen jars inside, maybe more. Each one filled with money. More money than she had ever seen in her entire life. The quiet building suddenly felt different. Not abandoned. Not empty. but waiting. And for the first time since stepping into that clearing, Ava realized something that sent a shiver down her spine. Her grandfather hadn't just left her land. He had been planning this. And whatever he had planned, she was only just beginning to discover it. For several long minutes, Ava Carter just sat there on the cold concrete floor, the jar resting in her hands. Money. Real money. The kind of money she had only ever seen behind glass counters or in movies. The worn green bills felt almost unreal between her fingers, soft with age, the edges slightly faded. She counted the bundle slowly. $20 bills. 50 of them. $1,000. Her breath caught in her throat. Ava looked back at the crate. If each bundle held 1,000, and each jar held several bundles, and there were more than a dozen jars. She stopped the thought before finishing it. The number felt too big, too impossible. Her hands trembled as she gently placed the money back into the jar and screwed the lid closed again. For a moment she simply stared at the crate. Then something inside her broke loose. A short laugh escaped her. Not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that comes when a person has been holding too much inside for too long. The laugh turned into a shaky breath. Then, suddenly, her eyes filled with tears. They came fast and without warning. Tears for the night spent wondering where she would sleep. For the years inside crowded group homes where everything belonged to someone else. For every moment she had felt like the world had quietly decided she didn't matter. Now here she was, sitting on a concrete floor in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a fortune. And the strange thing was, the money wasn't even what overwhelmed her the most. It was the realization that someone had believed in her enough to leave it there. Someone had thought ahead, planned ahead, protected her future before she even knew she would need it. Her grandfather, a man she had barely known. Ava wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and took a slow breath. "Okay," she whispered to the empty building. "Okay." The word echoed faintly off the curved metal walls. She stood and carefully placed the jar back into the crate. One by one, she checked the others. Every single jar was the same. Bundles of cash wrapped in old rubber bands, packed tightly inside the glass. At the bottom of the crate, beneath the straw lining, something else caught her eye. A thick leather notebook. The cover was worn and darkened with age. Embossed in faded gold letters across the front was a name, Daniel Carter, her grandfather. Ava sat down again and opened the journal carefully. The first page wasn't filled with notes or numbers. It was a letter. Her eyes moved slowly across the neat handwriting. "Ava, if you're reading this, it means two things. First, it means you made it to 19. And second, it means you were curious enough to open the crate. That makes me smile." Ava felt a strange tightness in her chest. The words felt almost like a voice reaching across time. She kept reading. "You probably think the money is the important part of what I left you. It isn't. The money is just a tool. What matters is the land. People will tell you this place isn't worth much. They'll say it's too far from town, too rough, too forgotten. Let them believe that. But if you're reading this, it means you now have something no one else can take away from you. A place to stand. A place to build." Ava lowered the journal slowly. Her eyes drifted around the massive empty building again. The rusted walls. The cracked concrete floor. The dust floating lazily in the beam of sunlight from the roof. A place to stand? Until that moment, she had been thinking about survival. Where to sleep. How to stretch $43 into as many days as possible. But now, for the first time, she was thinking about something else entirely. A future. Her grandfather hadn't left her money so she could run away. He had left it so she could build something. Something real. Ava looked back down at the journal and turned the page. The next entries were filled with sketches and notes, measurements, ideas, plans written in careful handwriting. He had thought about this place for years, maybe decades, and suddenly the old rusted building didn't look quite so hopeless anymore. It looked like a beginning. Outside, the sun was already dipping lower behind the mountains. The forest around the clearing had begun to grow quiet as evening crept in. Ava closed the journal gently and placed it back into the crate. Then she stood and walked toward the open doorway. The cold mountain air brushed against her face. For the first time since leaving the housing center, she didn't feel lost. She didn't feel like someone drifting through the world without direction. She had something now. Land. A shelter. A chance. And as she looked back at the rusted building behind her, a small determined smile appeared on her face. Because suddenly the place didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked like home waiting to be built. The first night Ava Carter spent on the property was colder than she expected. When the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, the temperature dropped fast. The metal walls of the old building held no warmth at all. Every gust of wind outside seemed to travel straight through the curved steel shell. She had no sleeping bag, no heater, only the thin jacket she was wearing and a small blanket she had stuffed into her backpack months ago. Ava gathered a pile of old canvas tarps she found in the corner and laid them across the concrete floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it was enough to keep the cold from creeping up through the ground. Then she sat there in the dim, fading light, listening. The forest had its own language at night. Branches creaked. Wind whispered through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance an owl called once. Then again. For a moment, fear pressed against her chest. She was 19 years old, alone in the mountains, sleeping inside a rusted building she had just discovered a few hours ago. A year ago, the thought would have terrified her. But something about the place felt different. Not safe exactly, but honest. No locked doors, no schedules, no strangers deciding what her life should look like. Just silence, and at possibility. Ava pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked toward the wooden crate sitting quietly in the corner. The money was still there. She had moved it away from the sunlight and covered it with an old tarp, almost instinctively protecting it. It didn't feel like something to spend. It felt like something to guard. Her grandfather's journal rested beside it, before lying down. Ava opened the journal again and read a few more pages by the light of her phone. Most of the entries were simple notes, measurements, sketches, plans for improvements to the structure. He had written about reinforcing the roof, adding insulation, building interior walls. It wasn't just a shelter he had imagined. It was a home. Eventually, the cold and exhaustion caught up with her. Ava curled up beneath the blanket and drifted into a restless sleep. Morning arrived slowly. A thin beam of sunlight slipped through the crack in the roof and stretched across the floor until it reached her face. Ava blinked awake. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the curved metal ceiling came into focus above her, and the memory of the crate full of money returned all at once. She sat up quickly. The tarp still covered the crate in the corner. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Outside, the forest looked peaceful in the pale morning light. Ava stepped out into the clearing and inhaled deeply. The air was cold but clean. Pine trees surrounded the property in every direction, their tall trunks glowing gold in the rising sun. For the first time in a long time, she felt awake. Really awake. But reality returned quickly. Money or not, survival still came first. She needed food, water, tools, and most importantly, a way to make the building livable. Ava walked back inside and uncovered the crate. Carefully, she opened one jar and removed a single bundle. $1,000. It felt strange taking it, almost like borrowing something that didn't fully belong to her yet. But she knew she couldn't build anything without help. She tucked the bundle into her backpack and hiked back toward the dirt road. The walk to town felt shorter in daylight. The small mountain town looked busier than it had the day before. A pickup truck rumbled past the diner. Someone swept the sidewalk outside the general store. Ava headed straight for the hardware store. A small bell chimed as she pushed the door open. The place smelled like wood shavings and machine oil. Shelves were stacked high with tools, rope, nails, and equipment she barely recognized. Behind the counter stood an older man with weathered hands and kind eyes. He glanced up from a newspaper. "Morning," he said. Ava hesitated for a second before answering. "Morning." The man studied her backpack, her worn boots, the uncertainty in her posture. "You fixing something?" he asked. Ava gave a small shrug. "Trying to." "What kind of place?" She paused, then said quietly, "An old building out past Old Timber Road." For a moment the man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You mean the old Carter property?" Ava blinked. "You know it." The man chuckled softly. "Everybody around here knows that place." He folded the newspaper and set it aside. "Well," he said, stepping around the counter, "if someone's finally fixing it up, we'd better make sure you've got the right tools." And for the first time since arriving in the mountains, Ava realized something important. She might not be as alone out here as she thought. In the weeks that followed, Ava Carter's life settled into a rhythm she had never known before. It was a simple rhythm. Wake up with the sun, work until the light faded, sleep, repeat. The first few days were the hardest. Her hands blistered quickly from using tools she barely understood. The axe the man at the hardware store had recommended felt awkward and heavy the first time she swung it. By the end of the first afternoon, her shoulders burned and her palms were raw. But every evening when she stepped back and looked at the clearing, something had changed. The weeds around the building slowly disappeared. The broken branches and fallen logs were stacked neatly into piles for firewood. Little by little, the place began to look cared for. The man from the hardware store turned out to be named Walter Hayes. He had lived in the town his entire life. The second time Ava walked into the shop, he didn't even ask what she needed. He simply nodded toward the back wall and said, "You're gonna want a proper saw if you plan on cutting lumber." Over the next few weeks, Walter became something like an unofficial mentor. He never pried into her past, never asked questions she didn't want to answer. Instead, he showed her things: how to sharpen an axe properly, how to reinforce weak sections of wood, how to patch a roof without creating leaks. Building something isn't about rushing, he told her one afternoon while they stood beside her truckload of supplies. It's about patience. You do it right once, and it'll stand longer than you will. Those words stuck with her, because patience was something Ava had never really been allowed to have before. Life in group homes was about surviving the day, not building a future. But now the future was exactly what she was working on. Inside the metal building, the changes were even more dramatic. The first thing Ava tackled was the roof. The crack that let sunlight in during the day also let freezing air in at night. Using a heavy tarp, rope, and a lot of careful climbing, she managed to seal most of the opening. The difference was immediate. The nights inside became quieter, warmer. Next came the stove, tucked away near the back